Harlow Creek, Texas was one of those towns, a flat, sun-scorched dot on the map where everybody's business belonged to everybody else, where opinions hardened like summer clay, and where a woman who didn't fit neatly into the shape the town had carved out for her would spend her whole life hearing about it. And nobody in Harlow Creek had a more firmly fixed opinion pinned to her name than Ada Voss. Ada was 30 years old in the autumn of 1878, and she had been too much for as long as anyone could remember, too determined, too self-possessed, too willing to look a man directly in the eye when she spoke to him, rather than casting her gaze politely downward the way the town's unspoken rule book seemed to prefer. She stood 6 feet tall in her boots, not remarkable in a world of basketball courts and high-fashion runways, but in a small Texas town in the 19th century, remarkable didn't begin to cover it. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and rearranged its gravity without trying, without even noticing, and that particular quality made a very specific type of man deeply, quietly furious. She ran the Voss Grain and Supply on the corner of 2nd and Meridian, had run it for 5 years ever since her father's eyesight had deteriorated past the point of keeping ledgers, and her mother had passed on the year before that, leaving Ada as the load-bearing wall of the family operation. She had learned the grain trade the same way she'd learned everything else in her life, by doing it, by refusing to pretend it was beyond her, by staying until she understood it better than anyone who had tried to tell her it wasn't her place. She could price a season's worth of feed contracts in her head before most men in Harlow Creek had finished their morning coffee. She could heft a grain sack, restring a broken scale, negotiate a freight rate down from Dallas, and have the quarterly books balanced before supper. The town called this overwhelming. The town had called her a great many things over the years, all of them dressed up in the polite language that communities use when they want to diminish someone without being seen doing it. She was a handful. She was formidable. She was, the older women said with a peculiar mixture of pity and admiration, a woman who would have been a great man, as though capability only made sense in one gender, as though Ada's particular brand of it was a malfunction rather than a gift. She had been courted, if you could call it that, 3 times. The first, at 22, by a cattle farmer named Orrin, who had spent their one and only shared supper explaining to her how a woman of her size and disposition could be useful on a working ranch, as though she were livestock being evaluated at auction. She had thanked him for the meal and wished him well, and he had spent the following decade telling anyone who would listen that Ada Voss had a cold heart. The second, at 25, was a traveling merchant from San Antonio who had told her, while reaching for the breadbasket, that she was a striking woman, but that a man needed to feel like a man in his own home. She had told him she hoped he found exactly what he was looking for, and he had departed Harlow Creek the following morning. The third, at 28, was a local banker who had genuinely seemed to like her, right up until the moment she had quietly corrected a significant error in his assessment of the Voss account. And he had never quite forgiven her for being right. The town had watched all 3 of these situations and drawn the obvious conclusion. Ada Voss was simply not built for partnership. She was built for solitude and ledger books, and that was that. Ada herself had a different read on the situation. She had decided somewhere around her 27th birthday that the problem had never been her. The problem had been a consistent failure of imagination on the part of the men who had come her way. She wasn't too much. They had simply been not enough. And those were 2 different equations entirely. She had made her peace with this, mostly in the honest hours of early morning when the supply house was quiet and the sparrows were starting up outside, and the Texas sky went from black to the particular bruised purple that precedes a dawn. She acknowledged to herself that peace and satisfaction were not the same thing. There was something she hadn't been able to name yet, a shape without an outline, a room she had never found the door to. She had largely stopped expecting to find it in Harlow Creek. She was wrong about that, too. His name was Reed Calloway. He arrived on a Tuesday in late September, when the heat had finally broken its stranglehold on the land and left something almost breathable behind. He had come to Harlow Creek because the Alderman Ranch, 7 miles south of town and one of the most respected cattle operations in that part of the territory, had spent the better part of 2 months searching for a new ranch manager. And Reed was the man they had eventually settled on. He had earned it the hard way, 14 years of cattle and land management stretching from Oklahoma down through New Mexico and back up through the Texas Panhandle. He was 37 years old, lean and weathered in the specific way that outdoor work weathers a person, with amber-colored eyes that were the first thing people tended to notice about him, and a way of listening that was the second. He was not a man who talked more than a situation required. He was not a man who performed anything. What you saw was what was there, and what was there was someone who had worked his whole adult life with integrity and had accumulated exactly the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. He came to Voss Grain and Supply on his second morning in town. A new ranch manager's first order of business was supply accounts, pricing, terms, delivery schedules, the working relationship that would form the backbone of day-to-day operations. He pushed through the door at 7:30, and Ada was already at the back of the store, reorganizing a wall of inventory with the systematic efficiency of someone who has done this particular task hundreds of times and has long since figured out the best way to do it. She turned when she heard the door. He hadn't quite known what to expect. The woman who faced him across the store was tall, nearly his own height, which was unusual enough that he registered it, with copper-brown hair that was gathered at the back of her neck in a practical knot, and eyes the color of deep water. She was wearing a canvas work apron over a dark dress, and there was nothing performative about the way she stood. She stood like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Morning," she said, her voice level and direct. "What can I do for you?" "Reed Calloway," he said, new manager out at the Alderman spread. "I need to open a supply account." She moved to the counter and opened a broad ledger. "Calloway, how do you spell it?" he told her. She wrote it. "What are you looking at for regular quantities?" she asked. He outlined the operation. She listened and wrote and asked 3 precise follow-up questions that told him she understood ranching and didn't need him to explain things twice. She quoted him prices, laid out the payment terms, told him what the Alderman account's previous arrangement had been, and that she'd extend the same terms to him on the same good faith basis. "Appreciated," he said. Their eyes met across the counter. Not briefly. For a moment that was just slightly longer than a standard business transaction required, in the particular way that happens when two people see each other clearly in the first few seconds and recognize something in what they find. "You've come a distance," she said. "Oklahoma last, New Mexico before that." He paused. "Long circuit. I'm done circling." She looked at him with an expression that was measuring and composed, and something else underneath that he couldn't quite read yet, but intended to. "Harlow Creek is a reasonable place to stop," she said, "depending on what you're looking for. So far," he said, "it's looking like the right decision." She almost smiled. He collected his copy of the account papers and walked back out into the September morning, and the whole ride south to the Alderman property, he found himself turning the encounter over in his mind with far more attention than he'd expected to give it. He came back Thursday, not for supplies. The account was new, the first delivery not due for another week. He came back because he had business at the post office, and the Voss Supply House was on the same block, and because this was the reason he gave himself, which held up under exactly as much scrutiny as he chose to apply to it. Ada was behind the counter reviewing a freight invoice when he came through the door. She looked up. "Mr. Calloway." Her tone was composed, but there was something alert in it. "Miss Voss?" He settled his hat on the edge of the counter. "I don't have a supply reason to be here. I'm going to be honest about that." She set her pencil down, waited. "I'm new to this town," he said. "I don't know who to trust, who to avoid, where a person eats a decent meal. A local's knowledge is worth more than a week of figuring it out myself." He paused. "You seem like someone who knows this place clearly." She considered him for a moment. There was something in the way she did it, not defensive, not flattered, just honest assessment that he found immediately interesting. "Mrs. Gallagher on the North Road does honest food at a fair price," she said. "The farrier on Meridian Street does good work and says so. The one on Creek Road does bad work and also says so, which is more confusing. The sheriff is reliable. The deputy is not yet, but he's learning." She tilted her head slightly. "Anyone specific you want to know about?" "Anyone in this town I should be cautious of?" he said. "Anyone who tells you Harlow Creek is simpler than it looks," she said. "It isn't. Nowhere is." He nodded slowly. "What about you?" he said. "Should I be cautious of you?" The directness of it registered. He saw it, a fractional stillness before she recovered her composure. "Most people in this town would say yes," she told him. Most people in this town don't know what they're talking about, he said. A beat of silence. You have been here, she said, 3 days. Long enough, he said. He bought a small coil of rope he didn't particularly need, said good afternoon, and left. Ada stood at the counter for a moment after the door swung shut, aware that her thoughts had departed from the freight invoice and were not planning to return to it anytime soon. Harlow Creek naturally noticed everything. By the end of the second week, it was common knowledge that the alderman's new man was appearing at Voss Grain more often than the supply schedule called for. By the third week, 2 separate people had mentioned to 2 separate friends that they had seen Ada Voss and the new alderman manager talking on the supply house steps after she had pulled the shutters for the night. By the end of the first month, the town had assembled a collective narrative. Reed Calloway either hadn't been properly informed about Ada Voss or someone needed to inform him better. Several people took this as a personal responsibility. It was Delia Marsh, who ran the dry goods on the main road and meant well by everything she did, even when she was wrong about it, who spoke to Reed most directly. She stopped him outside the post office on a Friday morning with the particular energy of someone who has decided to do someone a good turn, whether he wants one or not. You're spending time with Ada Voss, she said, skipping pleasantries. I am, Reed agreed. She's a good woman, Delia said. I want to be clear about that. But she is a lot. She has opinions on everything, and she shares them. She runs that store like she invented the concept of commerce. She is not. Delia chose her next word carefully. Easy. Reed looked at her with a patience that bordered on affectionate. Mrs. Marsh, he said, I've spent 14 years managing cattle operations in 3 territories. Easy has never been what I was looking for. Delia opened her mouth and closed it again. She turned down 2 men before someone had added later, recounting the story to him in case it had been omitted. Then she has good judgment, Reed said, and that was the end of that conversation. The Friday evening it changed was the last Friday of October, when the first real cold front of the season had pushed down from the north and turned the air sharp. Reed rode to town without a stated plan. He tied up outside Voss Grain at 6 o'clock, just as Ada was turning the key in the front lock, and she turned and found him there and waited. I don't have a reason, he said from the saddle. I know, she said. Walk with me, he said, along the creek bed if you're willing. She looked at him for a long, even moment. Then she hung her key on its hook, went inside for her coat, a long coat in dark wool that she had chosen herself with no consultation from anyone else's taste, and came back out. They walked together down to where Harlow Creek's namesake ran shallow and cold through the cottonwoods, and the stars came out with the serious brightness that cold air always brings, and neither of them talked for the first several minutes in a silence that was entirely comfortable. Then she told him about her father's deteriorating eyesight and how she had stepped into the supply house, not because anyone had asked her to, but because it needed to be done and she was the one who could do it. She told him about teaching herself freight contract law from a printed guide she had found in a dead man's estate auction, because there had been no one in Harlow Creek willing to teach it to her, and she had needed to know it. She told him what it was like to be competent in a world that kept suggesting her competence was the problem. He told her about the 14 years of movement, about learning to read land and cattle and weather and men and what each of them needed. He told her that he had stayed moving long past the point where he wanted to, because he hadn't found a reason substantial enough to stop that felt genuine rather than convenient. What made Harlow Creek different? She asked. You looked at other offers. I looked at several, he said. Alderman's terms were good, but that wasn't all of it. He paused. The creek moved past them. An owl called somewhere in the cottonwoods. Something about this part of the country felt settled in itself, he said, like it wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. He glanced at her. I hadn't been here 2 days before I started thinking maybe that was only part of the reason. She looked at him sideways. That's a great deal of implication for someone I'd met once. I know, he said. I'm not a subtle man. I've tried it and I don't see the value. She almost laughed. The real kind. The one that came up from somewhere genuine rather than being produced for an audience. They walked in quiet for a while. Then she said, in the way she said everything, plainly without apology, people have been talking to you about me. They have. And what did they say? That you were too much, he said. that no man had been able to manage you yet. He said it without inflection, just reporting a fact. She kept her eyes on the water. And I think, he said, that the men who came before me were working with the wrong measuring stick. They were measuring whether you fit inside their idea of what a woman should be. That's not a measurement of you. That's a measurement of them. He stopped walking and turned to face her. You don't have a too much problem, Ada. The men who said so had a too small problem. There's a difference. She stood still for a moment. The creek moved. The cold air settled. She looked at him with the full, composed, unflinching attention of a woman who has been in the habit of protecting herself for a long time and has just encountered something that makes her consider lowering the guard slightly. "You've known me 5 weeks," she said. 5 weeks, he agreed. "I know you taught yourself what you needed to know because you decided not to be stopped by not knowing it. I know you said no to men who weren't right for you and didn't lose any sleep apologizing for it. I know you run that supply house with more precision than most operations twice its size." He held her gaze. "And I know that when you think something is worth laughing at, you laugh at it, fully and out loud, without checking to see if anyone approves. That's not a character flaw. That's a character." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the moon cleared the cottonwoods and laid a pale trail along the creek surface. Then she said simply, "What is it you want, Reed?" "The chance," he said, "to be someone who sees you right, who actually measures you correctly, not against some idea of what's convenient, but against what's real." He paused. "If you'll give me it." She held his gaze. The creek ran. The stars burned over the flat Texas dark. "All right," she said. 2 words. Quiet as the water, and that was enough. November and December came in together that year, cold and clear. And what grew between Ada Voss and Reed Calloway grew in the straightforward way that things grow between 2 people who are honest with each other from the beginning. There was no performance of it, no managed impressions. They talked in the evenings at the supply house after Ada had turned the sign and banked the stove, and on weekends they rode out into the territory together on good horses, Ada on a gray mare named Petra that Reed had specifically selected from the alderman stock on the grounds that she was the right size for a serious rider, a detail he had thought about and handled without fanfare. The horse mattered to Ada more than he fully knew at first. 3 years earlier, she had been turned away from the livery with something that had been framed as practical concern and had felt like humiliation. He had simply found the right horse and said, "Here." The care in it moved her in a way she wouldn't have been able to explain, and didn't try to. They rode out to the south pasture on a December morning when the frost had done something extraordinary to the grass, each blade coated and individual and glittering. The whole field turned to hammered silver under the low winter sun, and they sat their horses at the fence line and looked at it without needing to say anything about it for a long while. "You were right," she said eventually. "I try to be, about what's worth seeing," he said. She looked at him. "That confidence of yours," she said. "Does it ever cause you trouble?" "Regularly," he said. "I find it worth it." She smiled, the full one, and he watched it happen and felt something in his chest that he had stopped expecting to feel 5 years ago settle firmly into place. "I came in through your door 5 weeks thinking about a supply account," he said. "I left thinking about you." He turned his horse so he was facing her directly. "I have been thinking about you at a consistent level of distraction ever since, which is notable for a man who generally keeps his focus where it belongs." She looked at the frost field, at the winter sun, at the man across from her who had shown up in her life with good horses and no performance, and the unusual quality of seeing her without flinching. There are moments when the shape of a thing you have wanted, without being able to name it, suddenly acquires edges and definition and becomes recognizable. This was that moment. The room she had never found the door to. She was standing in it now. "Reed," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ask me what you've been meaning to ask me." He asked. She said yes. They married in March, in a ceremony of exactly the length and character that suited them. Not brief out of indifference, but stripped to what mattered and unapologetic about what it left out. The Harlow Creek community attended in full, because communities always attend, and because there was an additional quality of fascination involved in witnessing the marriage of a woman the town had spent years writing off, and a man who had apparently read nothing they had written. Ada's father sat in the front row with the dignified, undisguised relief of a man who has watched his daughter carry more than her share for longer than he could comfortably remember, and who had hoped for years that someone capable of seeing her clearly would eventually come through the door. He had not embarrassed himself by hiding his feelings about it. There was no reason to hide them. Delia Marsh from the Dry Goods allowed afterward that she had always suspected Reed Calloway was exceptional. Bill Harmon at the livery, who had kept his counsel on the whole situation from the beginning, said only that he'd never had a doubt, which wasn't entirely true, but was the sort of thing a person says when a story turns out the right way. Reed managed the alderman operation with the competence that had gotten him hired, and with the additional quality that work takes on when a person has somewhere worth going at the end of the day. Something easier, steadier, more precise in its focus. Good work done by someone with a home is a different thing than the same work done by someone still looking for one. Ada ran the Voss supply. She kept Voss on the sign. It had been her father's name for 30 years and her name for 5, and she saw no logic in changing it. The accounts expanded. She took on the alderman books as a natural extension of the fact that she was already running the supply side of the relationship, and it made no sense to have two separate people doing adjacent work when one of them was significantly more efficient at it. Competence, she had always believed, fills the space it is given. She rode Petra every Saturday morning. This became in the patient way that Harlow Creek revised its opinions, not with announcements, not with any formal acknowledgement that a revision was occurring, but through the slow drift of one set of words replacing another. Simply a fact about Ada Calloway, which was what she was known as now in addition to Ada Voss, which she had always been. The town's collected assessment of her shifted over the course of those months and years in the only direction it had ever had room to shift, toward accuracy. She had not changed. The measuring stick had changed. The town had quietly, without admitting it was doing so, replaced its wrong measurement with a right one. She had always been exactly enough, exactly right. Precisely and completely herself in a way that most people spend their lives trying to manage and never quite achieve. It had simply required the arrival of one person who knew the difference between a woman who was too much and a world that was too small, and had the character and the sense to say so clearly without equivocation, on a cold night beside a dark creek with the stars watching and the cottonwoods bearing witness. And when he had asked her, and she had answered, and the story had found the ending it had been moving toward since a September morning, when a tall man with amber eyes had pushed through the door of a supply house in Harlow Creek, Texas, and looked across the counter at Ada Voss, she had been seen completely. Without reservation or reduction or the quiet diminishment that masquerades as affection. That was what she had been waiting for. Not rescue, not someone to complete what she lacked. She had lacked nothing. She had been waiting for someone big enough to stand beside what she was and call it, without hesitation, more than enough. He had said, "Sit down and let me show you," and everything after that had simply been true. End.